The storm that hammered Tombstone that October night in 1886 seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. Lightning split the sky like God's own fury, and the rain came down in sheets that turned the dusty streets into rivers of mud. But inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, the real storm was just beginning. Clint Mercer sat in his usual corner, a weathered man of 42 with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across a face marked by years of solitude and hard choices. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched. He never drank to forget, only to remember what mattered. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story." The Batwing doors burst open with such violence that every patron in the saloon turned to look. Thomas Grady stumbled in, his blacksmith's apron soaked through, his face a mask of desperation and terror. Sweat mixed with rainwater and tears as he scanned the room frantically. "Clint Mercer!" Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. "I need to talk to you." The saloon fell silent except for the drumming of rain on the roof. Clint didn't move, didn't even look up from his glass. He'd learned long ago that desperate men brought desperate troubles, and he'd had his fill of both. "Please," Thomas's voice broke. "It's about my boy. Ethan's gone." Now Clint looked up. He'd seen the Grady boy around town. A quiet, clever child of 12 with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn chin. The boy had lost his mother to fever 2 years back, leaving just him and his father to make their way in the world. "Sheriff's business," Clint said quietly, his voice like gravel. "Not mine." Thomas crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his boots squelching with each step. He slammed his hands down on Clint's table, leaning in close. "The sheriff thinks he ran away. Says boys do that sometimes when they're grieving their mothers. But you don't know Ethan. He wouldn't leave. Not without telling me. Not without taking his mother's locket." Clint studied the man's face. Thomas Grady was known throughout Tombstone as an honest blacksmith, a man who worked hard and kept to himself since his wife's passing. But there was something in his eyes now. Not just fear for his son, but something else. Guilt, maybe, or shame. "When did you last see him?" Clint asked. 3 nights ago. He went to bed same as always. Said his prayers, kissed his mother's picture goodnight. When I went to wake him for breakfast..." Thomas's voice trailed off, and he slumped into the chair across from Clint. His bed was empty. Window was open, but there was no note, no sign of struggle, just gone. "You check with his friends?" "Sarah Lee was the last to see him. They were playing by the old silver mine that afternoon. She said he seemed scared about something, kept looking over his shoulder. But when she asked what was wrong, he just said he had to get home before dark." Clint frowned. The abandoned silver mine was a dangerous place for children to play, full of unstable shafts and rotting timber. Most parents in town forbade their children from going near it. "What aren't you telling me, Grady?" Thomas flinched as if he'd been struck. "I don't know what you mean. You're holding something back. I can see it in your eyes. If you want my help finding your boy, you need to tell me everything." For a long moment, Thomas stared at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were haunted. "That night, the night Ethan disappeared, I wasn't home. Where were you?" I can't say, but I was gone from sundown till near midnight. When I got back, I checked on Ethan. He was sleeping peaceful as you please. I thought everything was fine." Clint leaned back in his chair. "Who knew you'd be away that night?" "Nobody. At least nobody should have known." Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "But what if someone was watching? What if they waited for me to leave?" The implications hung in the air like smoke. If someone had been watching the Grady house, waiting for Thomas to leave, then Ethan's disappearance wasn't random. It was planned. "I'll need to talk to the girl, Sarah Lee, and I'll want to see your house, the boys' room." Thomas's face flooded with relief. "You'll help me?" Clint stood, tossing a coin on the table for his untouched whiskey. "I'll look into it. But I work alone. And I do things my way. You don't like my methods? Find someone else. Anything. I'll pay anything you ask. I don't want your money, Grady. I want the truth. All of it. Because if you're lying to me about where you were that night, you might be putting your boy in more danger. Thomas nodded frantically. I understand. When do we start? We don't start anything. I start. You go home and wait. Clint pulled on his coat and settled his hat. And Grady, if I find out you've been lying to me about anything at all, I walk away. Clear? Crystal clear. As Clint headed for the door, Thomas called after him. Mr. Mercer, why are you helping me? Everyone knows you don't get involved in other people's troubles. Clint paused at the door, his hand on the frame. For a moment, his weathered face softened, and Thomas caught a glimpse of old pain in those steel-gray eyes. Because every child deserves someone to look for them when they're lost, Clint said quietly, even if their father can't tell the whole truth about why they're missing. The storm was still raging when Clint stepped out into the night. Lightning illuminated the empty streets of Tombstone, and thunder rolled across the desert like the sound of distant gunfire. Somewhere out there, a 12-year-old boy was either hiding in fear or being held against his will. And somewhere in this town, someone knew exactly what had happened to Ethan Grady. Clint pulled his coat tighter and headed toward the Grady house. The first rule of tracking was to start where the trail began. But as he walked through the muddy streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas Grady was hiding something big, something that might be the key to finding his son. The rain continued to fall, washing away tracks and evidence with each passing hour. But Clint Mercer had learned long ago that the most important clues weren't always the ones you could see. Sometimes they were the ones people tried hardest to hide. As he reached the modest house where the Gradys lived, Clint noticed something that made him pause. There were fresh horse tracks in the mud near the back of the house, tracks that the rain hadn't quite washed away. Someone had been here recently, someone who didn't want to be seen from the main street. The mystery of Ethan Grady's disappearance was deeper than a simple runaway case, and Clint had the unsettling feeling that before this was over, he'd uncover secrets that would shake Tombstone to its very foundations. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Tombstone, the storm having passed but leaving the town looking like a battlefield. Clint Mercer stood in Ethan Grady's bedroom, studying every detail with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years reading sign and tracking prey across the unforgiving desert. The room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall and a simple wooden desk by the window. A child's drawings covered one wall, pictures of horses and cowboys, and several of a woman with kind eyes who could only be Ethan's deceased mother. This window, Clint said, examining the frame. It opens easy? Thomas nodded, hovering nervously in the doorway. Too easy. I've been meaning to fix the latch, but... He trailed off, guilt written across his face. Clint ran his fingers along the windowsill. No scratches, no signs of forced entry. If someone had taken Ethan through this window, the boy had gone willingly or quietly. On the ground outside, the rain had washed away most tracks, but Clint could still make out the faint impression of boot prints near the wall. These prints, he said, pointing. They're not yours. Thomas leaned out the window to look. No, mine are bigger, and I wear different boots. Someone was standing here recently, watching maybe, or waiting. Clint straightened. I need to talk to the Lee girl now. The Lee family lived in a neat house on the respectable side of town, where the banker and the doctor and other prominent citizens made their homes. Sarah Lee was a bright-eyed girl of 11 with auburn braids and a direct way of speaking that reminded Clint of his own sister, long dead. Sarah, Clint said gently, crouching down to her level on the front porch. I need you to tell me about the last time you saw Ethan. Everything you remember, no matter how small. Sarah glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. We were playing by the old mine. Ethan found something. What kind of something? A piece of paper. It was all crumpled up, like someone had thrown it away. When he read it, his face went all white and scared. Clint felt his pulse quicken. Do you know what the paper said? He wouldn't tell me, but he kept looking around like someone might be watching us. Then he said he had to get home before his pa got back from... She stopped, biting her lip. From where, Sarah? It's important. I don't know. Ethan just said his pa had to go somewhere that night. Somewhere secret. He seemed worried about being alone. Thomas, who had been standing quietly behind Clint, made a strangled sound. When Clint looked at him, the blacksmith's face was pale as ash. "We need to search that mine," Clint said. The abandoned silver mine sat on a hill overlooking Tombstone, its entrance boarded up with weathered planks that bore warnings about unstable ground and dangerous gases. But children had a way of finding gaps in adult precautions, and sure enough, Clint found a loose board that had been pried aside. "Stay here," he told Thomas, lighting a lantern. "If this place comes down, no sense both of us being buried." The mine shaft stretched into darkness, supported by rotting timbers that creaked ominously with every step. Clint moved carefully, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick and stale, tainted with the smell of old earth and something else, something that made his skin crawl. 20 feet in, he found what he was looking for, a piece of paper wedged between two rocks where a frightened boy might have hidden it. Clint unfolded it carefully, holding it up to the lantern light. It was a note, written in a hasty scrawl. "If you want to see your boy again, bring $500 to the old water tower at midnight. Come alone. Tell no one, or the boy dies." But that wasn't what made Clint's blood run cold. It was the signature at the bottom. "A friend of your late wife." Clint stared at the note, pieces of a dark puzzle beginning to fall into place. Someone had been planning this for a while, someone who knew about Thomas's wife, about his habits, about when he would be away from home. This wasn't a random kidnapping, it was personal. He emerged from the mine to find Thomas pacing frantically. "Well, did you find anything?" Clint handed him the note without a word. Thomas read it once, twice, then crumpled it in his fist with a sound like a wounded animal. "Who would do this?" Thomas whispered. "Mary's been dead 2 years. What could this have to do with her?" "That's what we're going to find out. But first, you're going to tell me where you really were 3 nights ago." Thomas looked around desperately as if seeking escape. "I can't. If I tell you, it'll ruin everything." "Your son is missing, Grady. What could be more important than that?" For a long moment, Thomas wrestled with himself. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "I was at the railroad office, meeting with Silas Dunn." Clint felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. Silas Dunn was the most powerful man in Tombstone, the railroad tycoon who owned half the town and had his fingers in every profitable venture from here to Phoenix. He was also ruthless, vindictive, and not a man who took no for an answer. "What did Dunn want with you?" "He wants to buy my shop. The land it sits on is right where he wants to run his new spur line into town. He's been after me for months, but I keep refusing. That night, he offered me triple what the place is worth. And I still said no. That shop is all I have left of Mary. She helped me build it, worked beside me every day until she got sick. I can't just sell it to some railroad baron who'll tear it down for his tracks." Clint studied the man's face. "Dunn didn't take your refusal well, I'm guessing. He was furious, said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret crossing him. But I never thought—" Thomas's voice broke. "I never thought he'd go after Ethan." "We don't know that he did, but we're going to find out." Clint folded the ransom note carefully and tucked it into his coat. "First, we need to talk to someone who might know more about your wife's past. Someone who might understand what that note means." "Who?" "Doc Holliday. He's been in Tombstone longer than most, and he has a way of knowing things other people don't." They found Doc Holliday in his usual spot at the Oriental Saloon, dealing cards with the practiced ease of a man who'd made his living at gambling tables across the frontier. Despite his reputation as a gunfighter and his ongoing battle with consumption, Doc had always been fair in his dealings with Clint. "Well, well," Doc said, looking up from his cards. "The famous Clint Mercer, gracing us with his presence twice in 2 days. To what do I owe the honor?" "Need some information, Doc, about Mary Grady." Doc's expression grew serious. He folded his cards and gestured to an empty chair. "This about the missing boy? You heard? Word travels fast in a town this size. What do you want to know about Mary? Anything that might explain why someone would use her name to threaten her family?" Doc was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying Thomas with an intensity that made the blacksmith squirm. "Mary Grady wasn't always Mary Grady," he said finally. "Before she married Thomas, she was Mary Sinclair. And the Sinclair name carries some weight in certain circles." "What kind of circles?" "The kind that involve large sums of money and people who don't like to be crossed." Doc leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mary's father was a banker in Denver. Rich man, powerful connections. When he died, he left everything to Mary, his only child." Thomas stared at Doc in shock. "That's impossible. Mary never had any money. We struggled every day just to keep the shop running." "Because she gave it all away," Doc continued, "every penny. Donated it to churches, orphanages, anyone who needed help. Said she didn't want money that came from other people's misery." "Other people's misery?" Clint asked. Old man Sinclair wasn't particular about how he made his fortune. Foreclosures, predatory loans, that sort of thing. Mary found out after he died and couldn't stomach keeping the money. Clint felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. "Who else knew about this inheritance?" Doc's smile was grim. "Anyone who was paying attention to Denver banking circles 5 years ago, including certain railroad tycoons who might have had business dealings with Sinclair." The implications were staggering. If Silas Dunn had known about Mary's inheritance, if he'd somehow expected to get his hands on that money through business dealings with her father, then Mary's decision to give it all away would have cost him a fortune. "There's more," Doc said quietly. "Mary didn't just give the money away randomly. She was very specific about where it went, and one of the biggest donations went to a group fighting against railroad expansion in Colorado, a group that cost Silas Dunn a very profitable contract." Thomas looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. "She never told me any of this." "She was protecting you," Doc said gently, "and probably protecting herself. Men like Dunn have long memories and longer reach." Clint stood, his mind racing. The kidnapping wasn't just about forcing Thomas to sell his shop. It was revenge. Cold, calculated revenge for a financial loss that had festered for years. And now an innocent boy was paying the price for his mother's conscience. "Doc," Clint said, "if you were Silas Dunn, and you wanted to hide a kidnapped child somewhere in Tombstone, where would you put him?" Doc thought for a moment. "Dunn owns property all over town. But if I wanted somewhere isolated, somewhere no one would think to look." He paused, his eyes widening. "The old railroad depot. It's been abandoned for 2 years, ever since they built the new station. Dunn still owns it, but nobody goes there anymore." Clint felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before a dangerous confrontation. "Then that's where we start looking." As they prepared to leave, Doc called after them. "Clint, be careful. If Dunn is behind this, he won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in his way, including you." Clint touched the handle of his Colt .45, feeling its familiar weight. "Then he'd better make sure he doesn't miss." The abandoned railroad depot squatted on the outskirts of Tombstone like a wounded beast, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling in the harsh desert sun. Clint approached it carefully, every sense alert for danger. Thomas followed close behind, his face a mask of determination and barely controlled fear. "Stay back until I signal," Clint whispered, drawing his Colt. "If shooting starts, get to cover and stay there." The depot's main door was chained shut, but Clint found a loose board on the side of the building. He pried it aside just enough to slip through, then paused to let his eyes adjust to the dim interior. The building was empty except for dust and shadows. But as Clint moved deeper inside, he caught something that made his pulse quicken, the faint sound of voices coming from below. There was a basement. He found the entrance hidden behind a stack of old crates. The wooden stairs creaked ominously as he descended, but the voices grew clearer. 2 men, talking in low tones. "Kid's been asking for his pa all morning," one voice said. "Maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Jake," another voice interrupted. Mr. Dunn's orders were clear. "We keep the boy until his father comes around." Clint reached the bottom of the stairs and peered around the corner. The basement was lit by a single oil lamp, casting dancing shadows on the walls. 2 men sat at a makeshift table playing cards, their rifles leaning against the wall nearby. In the far corner, barely visible in the gloom, was a small figure huddled on a pile of blankets. Ethan Grady was alive. The boy looked scared but unharmed. His clothes dirty, but his spirit unbroken. Even from across the room, Clint could see the defiant set of his young jaw, his father's stubborn streak showing through. Clint counted his options. 2 armed men, 1 hostage, limited cover. Not ideal odds, but he'd faced worse. The key was speed and surprise. He moved like a ghost, using the shadows and the men's distraction to get closer. When he was 10 feet away, he stepped into the lamplight with his Colt trained on the nearest guard. "Hands where I can see them," he said quietly. Both men froze, their cards scattering to the floor. The one called Jake started to reach for his rifle, but stopped when Clint's gun swung toward him. "I wouldn't," Clint said. "I'm faster than you think, and I don't miss." "You're making a mistake, mister," the other guard said. "You don't know who you're messing with." "Silas Dunn," Clint replied. "And you're right. I don't know him. But I know his type. Rich men who think money makes them untouchable." Ethan had looked up at the sound of voices, his eyes widening when he saw Clint. The boy was smart enough not to call out, but Clint could see the hope flaring in his young face. "Here's how this works," Clint continued, keeping his gun steady. "You're going to stand up slowly, hands visible, and walk to that corner. Then you're going to sit down and stay quiet while I have a conversation with the boy." "Mr. Dunn ain't gonna like this," Jake muttered, but he complied. "Mr. Dunn's going to have bigger problems than his hurt feelings," Clint said. He moved to Ethan's side, keeping one eye on the guards. "You hurt, son?" Ethan shook his head. "They didn't hurt me, but they wouldn't let me go home. They said my pa had to do something for Mr. Dunn first." "What did they tell you about your father?" "That he was being stubborn about selling his shop. They said Mr. Dunn just wanted to talk to him, but—" Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. "I heard them talking when they thought I was asleep. They said something about my ma, about money she was supposed to have." Clint felt his anger building, cold and controlled. Using a child to settle old scores was low, even for a man like Dunn. "Did they say anything else about your mother?" "Just that she cost Mr. Dunn a lot of money, and now it was time to pay it back." Before Clint could respond, footsteps echoed from the stairs above. Heavy boots, moving with purpose. Clint cursed silently. He'd been so focused on the guards that he'd missed the approach of reinforcements. "Looks like the cavalry's arrived," one of the guards said with a smirk. 3 men descended the stairs, led by a figure Clint recognized from newspaper photographs, Silas Dunn himself. The railroad tycoon was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. He was flanked by 2 gunmen who looked like they'd shoot their own mothers for the right price. "Mr. Mercer," Dunn said pleasantly, as if they were meeting at a church social. "I've heard so much about you. The famous Loner Cowboy who rights wrongs and protects the innocent." "Dunn." Clint kept his gun trained on the original guards, but he was acutely aware of the new arrivals behind him. "Kidnapping children now? That's low, even for you." Dunn laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Kidnapping? That's a harsh word. I prefer to think of it as leverage. Young Ethan here is perfectly safe, as long as his father sees reason. What you want with Thomas Grady's shop isn't worth a child's life." "Oh, but you're wrong," Dunn said, his voice hardening. "This isn't just about a shop. This is about justice, about collecting on a debt that's been outstanding for far too long." "Mary Grady's inheritance," Clint said. Dunn's eyebrows rose slightly. "Very good. You've been doing your homework." "Yes. Mary Sinclair, as she was then, cost me a great deal of money with her Bleeding Heart charity. Money that should have been mine. Should have been yours. How? I had an arrangement with her father, a business partnership that would have been very profitable for both of us. When he died, I expected to work with his heir. Instead, I got a sanctimonious little girl who gave away a fortune to spite me." Clint felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together. "So you've been planning this revenge for years, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Patience is a virtue in business, Mr. Mercer. I've been watching the Grady family, waiting for the right opportunity. When Thomas refused my generous offer for his shop, I realized it was time to collect what I'm owed." By terrorizing a child? By using whatever leverage necessary to achieve my goals? Dunn's smile was cold as winter. Thomas will sell me that shop, and he'll do it for exactly what I choose to pay. Consider it interest on his late wife's debt. Ethan had been listening to this exchange with growing anger. Now he stood up, his young voice shaking with rage. My ma wasn't bad. She helped people. You're the bad one. Dunn's expression darkened. Sit down, boy, before I lose my patience. No, Ethan shouted. I won't let you hurt my pa. The boy lunged toward Dunn, but one of the gunmen caught him easily. In that moment of distraction, Clint made his move. He spun and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet taking the gunman holding Ethan in the shoulder. The man screamed and released the boy, who rolled away toward the corner. Chaos erupted in the basement. The original guards dove for their rifles while Dunn's remaining gunman drew his pistol. Clint threw himself behind an overturned table as bullets splintered the wood around him. Kill him! Dunn shouted. Kill them both! But Clint had been in more gunfights than he could count, and he knew how to use every advantage. The basement was poorly lit, full of shadows and obstacles. He moved like smoke, appearing just long enough to fire before melting back into darkness. His second shot dropped Jake, the guard's rifle clattering across the floor. His third caught the remaining gunman in the leg, sending him sprawling. Enough! Dunn's voice cracked like a whip. Stop shooting, you fools! You'll bring the whole town running! In the sudden silence, Clint emerged from cover with his gun trained on Dunn. It's over. Let the boy go. Dunn's face was flushed with rage, but his voice remained controlled. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Mercer. I own this town. I own the sheriff, the mayor, half the businesses. You think you can just walk in here and— I think I just did, Clint interrupted. Ethan, come here. The boy ran to Clint's side, his face streaked with tears but his spirit unbroken. Is my pa okay? He's fine. He's waiting outside. Clint kept his gun on Dunn. We're leaving now, all of us. You can't prove anything, Dunn said. It's your word against mine, and I have more friends in this town than you do. Maybe, but I have something you don't. What's that? Clint smiled grimly. The truth. And a witness who's going to tell everyone in Tombstone exactly what kind of man Silas Dunn really is. As they climbed the stairs, Ethan clinging to Clint's side, Dunn called after them. This isn't over, Mercer. You have no idea what you've started. But Clint didn't look back. He'd heard threats before, from men who thought money and power made them untouchable. Most of them learned eventually that there were some things that couldn't be bought. Outside, Thomas was waiting with barely controlled anxiety. When he saw his son, he fell to his knees and gathered the boy into his arms, tears streaming down his weathered face. Ethan, thank God you're safe. I'm okay, Pa, Ethan said, hugging his father tight. Mr. Mercer saved me. But Pa, that man said terrible things about Ma. He said she owed him money. Thomas looked up at Clint over his son's head. Is it true? What Dunn said about Mary's inheritance? It's true. But your wife did the right thing, Grady. She chose conscience over money. That's not a debt. That's something to be proud of. Thomas nodded, understanding passing between the two men. What happens now? Clint looked back at the depot, where Dunn and his wounded men were probably planning their next move. Now we make sure the whole town knows what really happened here, and we make sure it never happens again. But even as he spoke, Clint knew this was far from over. Men like Silas Dunn didn't give up easily, and they had long memories. The final confrontation was still to come. The news of Ethan Grady's rescue spread through Tombstone like wildfire. By noon the next day, the entire town was buzzing with talk of Silas Dunn's involvement in the kidnapping. But Clint knew that talk was cheap, and powerful men like Dunn had ways of making inconvenient truths disappear. He found Thomas at his blacksmith shop, working the forge with unusual intensity. The rhythmic hammering of metal on metal seemed to be the man's way of working through his anger and fear. Dunn's been busy, Clint said, watching Thomas shape a horseshoe with precise, violent strikes. Word is he's claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Says his men were just keeping Ethan safe after they found him wandering near the old mine. Thomas's hammer paused mid-strike. And people believe that? Some do. Money talks loud in this town, and Dunn's got plenty of it. Clint leaned against the doorframe. But not everyone's buying his story. Doc Holliday's been spreading the real version, and Sarah Lee told her parents everything she knows about that note Ethan found. What about the sheriff? Sheriff Bean's in Dunn's pocket, just like Dunn said. But there are other kinds of law in Tombstone. Thomas set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his brow. What do you mean? I mean, sometimes justice comes from the people, not from badges and courtrooms. Clint straightened. There's going to be a town meeting tonight. Dunn's called it, probably to try to control the narrative, but it might be our chance to expose him for what he really is. You think the townspeople will stand up to him? Depends on how much courage they can find when it counts. Clint's expression was grim. But there's something else you need to know. I've been asking around about Dunn's business dealings. Turns out your shop isn't the only property he's been trying to acquire through questionable means. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? The widow Henderson? Her husband died in that mine accident last year, and suddenly she's behind on her mortgage payments to Dunn's bank. The Martinez family? Their restaurant burned down under mysterious circumstances, and now Dunn's offering to buy their land for half what it's worth. The implications were staggering. You think he's been terrorizing other families too? I think Silas Dunn has been playing a long game, using fear and intimidation to reshape this town to his liking. Your wife's inheritance was just the beginning. Now he's after everything. That evening, the town hall was packed with nearly every resident of Tombstone. Silas Dunn stood at the front of the room, impeccably dressed and radiating confidence. His wounded men were nowhere to be seen, but Clint noticed several new faces in the crowd. Hard-looking men who didn't belong in a community meeting. Friends and neighbors. Dunn began, his voice carrying easily through the room. I've called this meeting to address the disturbing rumors that have been circulating about me and my business interests. A murmur ran through the crowd. Clint stood at the back of the room with Thomas and Ethan, watching the faces of the townspeople. Fear, uncertainty, and anger warred in their expressions. It's true that there was an incident yesterday involving young Ethan Grady, Dunn continued, but the facts have been distorted by those who would see our community torn apart by baseless accusations. That's a lie. The voice came from the middle of the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, the widow, stood up with shaking hands, but a determined voice. You've been threatening me for months, Mr. Dunn, saying I'll lose my home if I don't sell to you. Dunn's smile never wavered. Mrs. Henderson, I understand you're grieving, but business is business. I've offered to help you with your financial difficulties out of the goodness of my heart. By offering half what my property's worth? Mrs. Henderson's voice grew stronger. By having your men follow me home from church? More voices joined in. The Martinez family spoke of the mysterious fire that destroyed their restaurant. A rancher named Coleman told of cattle that had been poisoned after he refused to sell his water rights. One by one, the stories poured out, a pattern of intimidation and coercion that painted a clear picture of Dunn's methods. Enough! Dunn's facade finally cracked. These are the ravings of disgruntled people who can't accept the realities of progress. Tombstone is growing, changing. Those who can't adapt will be left behind. What about kidnapping children? The voice was young but clear. Ethan Grady stepped forward, his father's hand on his shoulder for support. Is that progress too, Mr. Dunn? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the 12-year-old boy who had survived 3 days of captivity with his courage intact. Tell them what you told me, Ethan said, his voice carrying in the hushed room. Tell them about my ma's money and how you think we owe you something. Dunn's face darkened. The boy is confused, traumatized. He doesn't understand. I understand plenty, Ethan interrupted. I understand that you had your men grab me from my bedroom. I understand that you kept me locked up in that basement. And I understand that you think money gives you the right to hurt people. The crowd began to stir, angry murmurs growing louder. Clint saw Dunn's hired guns moving closer to the front of the room, hands drifting toward their weapons. The boy is obviously disturbed, Dunn said, his voice rising. Perhaps his father's grief has affected his judgment as well. I think it's time to end this farce. He gestured to his men, and Clint saw the signal for what it was. Violence was coming, and innocent people were about to be caught in the crossfire. But before Dunn's gunmen could draw their weapons, the doors of the town hall burst open. Sheriff Bean entered, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came a man Clint recognized, U.S. Marshal Williams, whose jurisdiction superseded any local corruption. "Nobody move," the marshal commanded, his badge glinting in the lamplight. "This meeting is now under federal investigation." Dunn's face went white. "Marshal Williams, what's the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Mr. Dunn, is that kidnapping is a federal crime, especially when it involves crossing territorial lines and interfering with interstate commerce." The marshal's voice was steel. "We've been investigating reports of your business practices for months. Last night's incident was just the evidence we needed." "You can't prove anything," Dunn snarled, but his confidence was cracking. "Actually, we can." Doc Holliday stepped forward from the crowd, a satisfied smile on his pale face. "You see, Silas, you made one crucial mistake. You trusted Jake Morrison with your secrets." Dunn's eyes widened. "Jake would never—" "Jake's singing like a canary with a broken wing," Doc continued. "Seems he doesn't fancy the idea of hanging for kidnapping. He's told us everything. About the systematic intimidation, the bribes, the threats, even about your plans to force the railroad through properties you've acquired through coercion." The marshal stepped forward. "Silas Dunn, you're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Dunn's hired guns looked around nervously, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The townspeople had found their courage, and there was no backing down now. As the marshal's men placed Dunn in shackles, the railroad tycoon's eyes found Clint across the room. "This isn't over, Mercer. I have friends in high places. I'll be back." "Maybe," Clint replied quietly, "but Tombstone will be ready for you." As Dunn was led away, the town hall erupted in cheers and applause, but Clint felt no satisfaction in the victory. He'd seen too many powerful men escape justice through money and connections. The real test would come in the courts. 3 months later, Clint sat in the Silver Dollar Saloon, reading a newspaper that had arrived on the morning stage. The headline made him smile. "Railroad Tycoon Sentenced to 20 Years in Federal Prison." The article detailed how Dunn's empire had crumbled under federal investigation. His properties were being sold to pay restitution to his victims. The railroad spur through Tombstone had been canceled, leaving the town to grow at its own pace. Good news? Thomas Grady approached the table, looking healthier and happier than Clint had ever seen him. "The best," Clint replied, folding the paper. "Dunn won't be bothering anyone for a long time." Thomas sat down, signaling the bartender for 2 whiskeys. "Ethan wanted me to thank you again. He's been telling everyone at school about how the famous Clint Mercer saved him from the bad man." "The boy saved himself," Clint said. "All I did was show up. You did more than that. You gave this town back its courage." Thomas raised his glass. "To justice. To justice," Clint agreed, but he didn't drink. Instead, he stood and tossed a coin on the table. "I'll be moving on tomorrow." "Where to?" Clint settled his hat and looked toward the door. "Wherever the next person needs help. That's what I do." As he walked out into the Tombstone sunshine, Clint heard the sound of children playing in the street. Among them was Ethan Grady, laughing and running with his friends, the trauma of his ordeal already fading into memory. Sometimes, Clint reflected, justice wasn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it was simply about making sure the innocent could sleep safely in their beds, knowing that someone was watching over them in the darkness. The lone cowboy mounted his horse and rode out of Tombstone, leaving behind a town that had learned the difference between power and justice. Somewhere ahead, another town, another family, another child might need his help, and Clint Mercer would be ready. "Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.